Rome, once a small and insignificant city in central Italy, would eventually rise to cover the entire Mediterranean. Little by little, the Romans forged one of the greatest empires in history, reaching from the Atlantic in the west to Mesopotamia in the east, from Britain in the north to the Sahara in the south. The profound impact the Romans had on the course of history can be felt even today. But this story starts far away from the Italian peninsula in the bygone times when gods and heroes still walked among us. For 10 years, the Greek armies, under the High King Agamemnon, besieged the legendary city of Troy, but they were unsuccessful and utterly powerless. Even the mighty Achilles was no match for the impregnable Trojan walls. The defense of the city was organized by Hector, his brother Paris, and their young cousin Aeneas. The Greeks had no hope of ever taking the city, as this was not just an ordinary war between the two nations, but rather a struggle between the gods themselves. With Aphrodite and Apollo aiding the Trojans, and Athena and Poseidon aiding the Greeks, the war turned into a prolonged stalemate. Eventually, the Greeks decided to cut their losses and return home. As an offering to Athena, they built a massive wooden horse out of ship parts. When the Trojans realized that the siege was finally lifted, they hauled the giant horse into the city and celebrated all night. However, when the city watch fell asleep, the Greeks hidden inside the horse jumped out and opened the gates. The rest of the Greek army that was hidden just out of view rushed into the city and took it from within. While they were busy killing every Trojan in their path, the gods appeared to Aeneas in his sleep. He was instructed to gather as many people as he could and leave the city under the cover of darkness. Taking the Palladium, a mystical carving of the goddess Athena known as the Luck of Troy, the survivors embarked on a great journey across the Mediterranean in hopes of finding a new home. This journey was described by Roman poet Virgil in his epic work, the Aeneid. For years, the refugees sailed the seas, visiting numerous Greek islands and encountering all sorts of mythical creatures, not unlike Odysseus before them. After a small detour to Sicily, Aeneas finally arrived in northern Africa, where he found a bustling Phoenician colony, Carthage. Founded in 814 BC by Queen Dido, who also had to flee her homeland, Carthage soon grew into a regional power. Although the events of the Trojan War occurred some 400 years before the founding of the city, we can be certain that the ancient authors didn't lose any sleep over such minutiae. The Trojans were welcomed into the city, and a marriage pact between Aeneas and Dido was agreed. But the gods had other plans and ordered Aeneas to continue on his journey in search of a new homeland for his people. When Dido saw his ships leaving, she cursed him and his descendants, proclaiming endless hate between Carthage and the sons of Troy, before ending her life. After sowing the seeds of the Punic Wars, the Trojans continued on their way. Following another small detour, this time to the depths of the underworld where Aeneas met his late father, he and his men reached Italy. 7 years after the fall of Troy, the Trojans finally disembarked near the mouth of the river Tiber. Exhausted and running low on supplies, they resorted to plundering the countryside. The king of the Laurentians, old man Latinus, gathered his men and charged the invaders. But seeing the sorry state the Trojans were in, he invited Aeneas to a council. Hearing the story of the fall of Troy and their subsequent wanderings, Latinus took pity on them and offered his friendship and an alliance. Hoping to finally end the wandering of his people, Aeneas eagerly accepted the offer. He married the king's daughter, Lavinia, adding a personal bond between the two leaders. Aeneas founded a town named Lavinium in honor of his wife. The Trojan Odyssey was finally over, and they could settle down in these new lands. In time, Lavinia would bear Aeneas a child, whom they named Ascanius. Another tradition claims that Ascanius was born in Troy before the destruction. Whatever the case may be, Ascanius had another name, Iulus. One of the most influential patrician families in Roman politics, the Iulii, claimed descent from Ascanius Iulus, and by proxy from Aeneas and his mother, the goddess of love and beauty, Venus. Before the arrival of the Trojans, Lavinia had been promised to Turnus, the king of the nearby Rutuli. Angered by this insult, he gathered his forces and charged these invaders. The combined forces of the Trojans and the Laurentians successfully pushed back Turnus, but King Latinus was killed in the fighting, leaving Aeneas as the sole ruler of the two peoples. Not accepting his defeat, Turnus turned to the Etruscan king Mezentius, the ruler of the nearby Caere. Concerned by the news of these strange foreigners, Mezentius agreed to aid Turnus and attack Lavinium. Hoping to unite the two peoples, Aeneas gave them the name Latins, honoring the late king. From then on, the Trojans and the Laurentians would act as one, never looking back on their ancestry. Rather than waiting for an attack behind their walls, the Latins rushed out to meet the aggressors. With his dying act, Aeneas pushed back Mezentius and secured a lasting peace for his people. The river Tiber would, from then on, mark the boundary between the Etruscans and the Latins. A tomb for Aeneas was built on the banks of the Numicus River, marking the final resting spot for the progenitor of the Latin people. Aeneas was succeeded by his son Ascanius, who was still too young to rule. His mother, Lavinia, assumed the regency and protected their people. When Ascanius came of age, rather than taking control of Lavinium, he left his mother in charge and set off to found another city at the foot of the Alban Hills, naming it Alba Longa. Ascanius ruled in peace until his death. His crown passed down from father to son in an unbroken line for 12 generations, reaching Procca. King Procca had two sons, Numitor and Amulius. The elder son, Numitor, was set to inherit the throne, but Amulius expelled his brother and seized the crown for himself. Hoping to prevent any claimants from challenging his reign, he killed all of Numitor's sons and forced his only daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, thus ensuring she could not bear children. But it seems that the fates had already decreed the origin of the greatest city known to man, and Rhea was forcibly violated, giving birth to twin boys. She claimed that this vile act was done by the god of war, Mars, but this didn't save her or her twins from the wrath of Amulius. Rhea was thrown into prison, and the boys were ordered to be drowned in the river. It just so happened that the Tiber was overflowing at the time. The soldiers, fearing for their own lives, decided to leave the twins in one of the streams near the banks of the river, hoping this would be enough to drown them. But as the water receded, the boys were left on dry land. A she-wolf was attracted to the river by the crying of the twins. She nursed them until a herdsman named Faustulus came along and saw the wolf gently licking the boys. He took the twins home, named them Romulus and Remus, and raised them with his wife as their own sons. Although the Romans generally believed in these stories, they too questioned the veracity of some of the more mythical parts. Roman historian Livy gives us a possible explanation for their origin. As he states, the herdsman's wife was a prostitute known as Lupa, meaning wolf, which eventually gave rise to the she-wolf legend. The twins grew up to be strong and capable young men. They enjoyed roaming through the woods on various hunting expeditions. Growing in strength and honing their abilities, the youth set their sights on a greater prize. They began attacking local brigands and taking their loot. They would then distribute the spoils among the shepherds. Slowly, a group of like-minded young men gathered around the twins. Enraged by the loss of their loot, the brigands decided to put a stop to their mischief. During the festival of Lupercalia, they set up a trap for the twins. Romulus managed to evade the attackers, but his brother Remus was not as lucky. He was captured and brought before the local chief, who was none other than their grandfather Numitor. Faustulus, realizing that one of his foster sons was in grave danger, told Romulus the marvelous story of how he had found them near the river. The herdsman was well aware of the tale of Rhea Silvia and her twins, and he connected the dots long ago. However, he kept this information to himself, knowing that their lives would be forfeit if the truth got out. The time for caution was now over, and armed with this new information, Romulus charged off to meet Numitor. But even before Romulus could reach his brother, Numitor too came to the same conclusion. After questioning Remus and noting his royal bearing, he was convinced that the boy was one of his long-lost grandsons. Romulus only confirmed his suspicions, and the two brothers were reunited. A plan was immediately hatched to depose Amulius and retake the throne of Alba Longa. They lacked the strength to take the city by direct assault, and they chose a more stealthy approach. Romulus led a small group of shepherds from one side, while Remus and Numitor's men came in from the other. Surprised by this sudden onslaught from multiple directions, Amulius was powerless to mount an effective defense, and he was quickly killed. The Alban soldiers, realizing what had happened, were now ready to bear down on them. However, before they could strike, they recognized Numitor, their former leader. Numitor still had a kingly aura, and the men listened as he spoke. He condemned his brother's actions, recounting the story of his sons and his daughter, Rhea Silvia. He then presented the twins to the townsfolk. The soldiers abandoned their assault and accepted Numitor as their rightful liege. Having returned their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa, the twins decided to found a new city on the banks of the Tiber, where they had been found by a she-wolf all those years ago. The twins were joined by settlers from both Lavinium and Alba Longa, along with a number of their friends among the shepherds. They were all hard at work on their new town, but even before the foundations were finished, a disagreement arose between the two brothers. They both had the ambition to rule, but seniority could not resolve the matter as they were twins. In one version of the story, the brothers, lacking alternative solutions, turned to the gods. Romulus chose the Palatine Hill and Remus the Aventine. From there, they waited for a divine sign. In time, 6 vultures landed on the Aventine. Seeing this as a clear omen, Remus declared himself king. It is at that moment that 12 vultures landed on the Palatine. Not to be outdone by his brother, Romulus too declared himself king. With one side claiming priority of time and the other priority of number, they still couldn't agree on a single sovereign. The ensuing altercation turned violent, and Remus was killed by Romulus or one of his men. In the other, more famous version of the story, Romulus was hard at work fortifying the Palatine. Remus, mocking his brother, jumped over his half-finished wall. Enraged, Romulus killed Remus, exclaiming, "So perish, whoever shall overleap my battlements." Whatever the case may be, Romulus was left as the sole ruler of this new city that would bear his name in eternity. And thus Rome, the greatest city of antiquity, was born. The legendary date of the founding of Rome is April 21st, 753 BC. A temple was built on the Palatine, and the Palladium was placed inside. According to legend, as long as the Palladium was kept inside the city walls, Rome would not fall to foreign invaders. We should pause this story here to examine what little historical evidence we do have. There are no surviving documents from the earliest centuries of the city. What has survived is the oral tradition passed down through generations until it was finally written down by historians like Livy and his predecessors. The foundation of Rome was not a single event, like many Greek foundation myths, but rather a gradual process that predates Romulus and would continue into the times of his successors. The Romans had 2 foundation stories and 2 founding fathers, Aeneas and Romulus. Later Roman writers did their best to connect the 2 stories, inadvertently creating chronological problems in the process. Aeneas was a member of the Trojan royal family and only a minor character in the Iliad. He is notable primarily for escaping the destruction of the city. A line in the epic suggests that his descendants would rule Troy once more, but considering no member of the ruling dynasty ever appeared in the Troad, Greek writers started looking for his descendants in the west. Stories of his wanderings began emerging throughout the Greek world and the wider Mediterranean. The earliest surviving reference connecting Aeneas to Rome appears in the 5th century BC. With the patronage of the first Roman emperor, Augustus, Virgil took these disparate elements and combined them into a compelling founding myth. His epic poem, the Aeneid, is regarded as one of the greatest works of Latin literature. Hoping to legitimize the rule of Augustus and Julius Caesar before him, Virgil incorporated the connection to Ascanius Iulus into the narrative, thus linking the Iuli to these ancient founders. On the other hand, the myth of Romulus seems to be considerably older and more local in origin. The story contains a plethora of elements found in other foundation myths and origin stories. Some of these elements are present across the Mediterranean and the Middle East, but also as far away as the Americas, South Africa, and Polynesia. This means that they can't be easily explained as a common tradition of a specific group, but are rather popular expressions of shared human ideas. This implies that the myth of Romulus was both ancient and indigenous. It is believed that the famous bronze statue of a she-wolf, known as the Capitoline wolf, was created by an Etruscan craftsman in the 5th century BCE. However, radiocarbon dating suggests that it was made much later, around the 11th century. These findings are inconclusive, and there is still no consensus on the matter, with many scholars favoring the Etruscan origin. Livy mentions that the statue of the she-wolf was erected at the foot of the Palatine Hill, and it was also mentioned by other Roman authors such as Pliny the Elder and Cicero. Some believe that these authors describe the Capitoline wolf. The twins were added to the statue around the 15th century when it was transferred to a museum. Regardless of its true origin, the statue is one of the most famous icons of ancient Rome, and it can still be found atop the Capitoline Hill. What we can say for certain is that the myth of Romulus and the she-wolf was widely accepted in Rome by around 300 BC at the latest. One of the first silver coins minted by Rome in 269 BCE featured a motif of the wolf suckling the twins. Although these myths contain little historical fact, they are nonetheless valuable. They stood alongside stories of possibly historical figures of the early Republic, like Brutus and Cincinnatus. Later Romans would look back at these simpler times of shepherds living in thatched huts and lament the passage of time and the deterioration of fundamental Roman values. These comparisons were especially striking during the reign of Caesar and Augustus, when the institutions of the Republic faltered and Rome slid back into monarchy. These myths also show how the Romans wished to be seen by other people of the era. Instead of one indigenous group founding the city, Rome emerged from a blend of various cultural influences. From its humble origins, Rome grew by extending citizenship rights to various different peoples, a practice that the Romans continued well into the times of the empire. By incorporating first the Italians and later other foreigners into the population, Rome was able to call upon enormous numbers of soldiers to fight their expansionist wars. This is in stark contrast with their Greek neighbors, who strictly guarded their citizenship, leading to stagnation or in some cases decline of the population. These legends involving gods and heroes from the mythical past suggest that Rome was destined to rise above all other cities in the Mediterranean. The real story, however, is far less grandiose, and Rome's eventual rise is far less certain than these myths would lead us to believe. Prehistoric Italy was a hotbed of diverse and separate cultures. Divided by the Apennine mountain range, the ancient tribes of early Italy developed more or less independently from each other. Historians have identified over 40 distinct languages and dialects across the region. With the Roman conquest of Italy during the early Republic, these languages were gradually pushed out and replaced by Latin. Most of them are poorly documented and remain undeciphered. The languages of prehistoric Italy can be broadly divided into two main groups: those that belong to the Indo-European family and those that do not. The main non-Indo-European language of the peninsula was Etruscan, spoken in the region of Etruria, north of the Tiber, and in parts of Campania. Although spoken by the first advanced civilization on the peninsula, Etruscan remains undeciphered, shrouding the civilization in mystery. Other languages in this category are Rhaetic, possibly related to Etruscan, and the mysterious language of the Novillara inscriptions. However, most of the languages spoken on the peninsula were Indo-European, or more specifically Italic. Among these, the most significant is of course Latin. Originally spoken only in a small region of Latium south of the Tiber, Latin would go on to become the most influential language in the whole of Europe. Closely related to Latin is Faliscan, spoken further upstream of the Tiber. Once believed to be a separate language, new evidence suggests that Faliscan was no more than a dialect of Latin. Other closely related languages to Latin are Venetic, spoken in northeastern Italy around modern-day Venice, and Sicel, the extremely poorly documented language of the indigenous Eastern Sicilians. These languages are sometimes referred to as West Italic. The other Italic languages of the peninsula form a closely related family of Osco-Umbrian languages spoken in central and southern Italy. Central Italian tribes like the Sabines, Marsi, Equi, Volsci, and others all spoke Umbrian dialects, while the southern tribes such as the Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians spoke Oscan. Other, non-related Indo-European languages in Italy were Greek in the south, Mesopic in the southeast, Celtic in the north, and Ligurian in the northwest. Mesopic is related to Illyrian, while Ligurian is a mysterious and poorly documented language, possibly related to Celtic. Greek and Celtic are relatively late arrivals. These languages tell a story of prehistoric Italy and the movements of populations. According to the invasion model, the various Indo-European languages came to Italy in successive waves of migration. Recent genetic studies suggest that the Etruscans were indigenous to the region, implying that Etruscan developed from one of the Neolithic languages predating the Indo-Europeans. In the first wave of migration, dated to the later half of the second millennium, came the West Italics. Coming in from the east, they pushed back the indigenous population to the west of the peninsula. The Western Italics were then squeezed into separate pockets by the arrival of the Osco-Umbrians. The migrating Illyrians then crossed the Adriatic, settling in the region of Apulia. Starting in the 8th century BC, the Greeks founded the first colonies in southern Italy, the region now known as Magna Graecia. The Celts crossed the Alps around the 6th century, settling around the Po Valley and along the northern coast of the Adriatic. Another change happened around the 5th century when Oscan tribes from central Apennines migrated south towards Campania, Lucania, and Bruttium. It speaks volumes that the Romans managed to unite all these disparate elements under a single banner. The history of the Italian tribes before the Roman conquest is shrouded in mystery. The earliest surviving historical records are dated to the 2nd century BC, while the earliest of their sources are from the 5th century. This means that there is still a significant 400-year gap from the beginning of the Iron Age to the first historical records. Some of these gaps are partially filled by archaeological evidence, but there is only so much that we can learn from ancient ruins and burial sites. During the Bronze Age, Italy was populated by a fairly uniform Apennine culture. Evidence of this culture can be found across the peninsula, mainly through burial sites and traces of pottery. However, during the wider Bronze Age collapse in the Mediterranean, around 1200 BC, this culture disappeared entirely, only to be replaced by several different cultures. While some of them exhibit continuity with the preceding Apennine culture, others present a break in tradition. Problematically, large-scale migrations of population that would support invasion theory have not yet been found in the archaeological record. Starting around the 8th century, the Villanovan culture, present in Etruria and the Po Valley, developed into the first advanced civilization of Italy, the Etruscan civilization. With the rise of the population in the early Iron Age, settlements in Etruria grew in power and significance. Large mineral deposits found in the region attracted Greek and Phoenician traders, sparking a technological revolution. The Etruscans adopted the Greek writing system, forming a foundation for the later Latin alphabet. In time, the 12 city-states of Etruria united into a loose confederation, forming the Etruscan League. At the height of their power, around the 500s BC, the Etruscans controlled the area from the Po Valley in the north to the fertile plains of Campania in the south. But facing mounting pressures from migrating Celts and Samnites, as well as the rising power of the Roman Republic in the south, Etruscans gradually lost territory and influence. They were ultimately conquered by Rome in 264 BC, marking the end of their civilization. Under Roman rule, their language would gradually fade, slowly replaced by Latin, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. South of the Etruscan cities, on the western coast of central Italy near the mouth of the river Tiber, stood a small tribe known as the Latins. A relative lack of mineral deposits made the region uninteresting for the seaborne traders, and Latium lagged behind its northern neighbor. Gradually, as land routes connecting Etruria and Campania saw increased activity, the Latins joined trade networks, resulting in sustained economic growth. Initially, the Alban Hills were the center of trade in Latium, but slowly they faded into obscurity as the new site on the banks of the Tiber grew in importance. This shift can also be seen on the other side of the Tiber, where Way grew at the expense of nearby Caire. An island on the Tiber slows down the current, creating a convenient crossing spot on the river. On the left bank of the river, a series of hills creates a well-defensible position controlling this crossing. The earliest traces of a permanent settlement in the region can be dated back to around 1000 BC. Starting as individual villages on these hills, namely the Palatine and the Capitoline, the communities grew until they united into a single city known as Rome. Throughout its history, Rome was known as the City of Seven Hills. Controlling the trade routes of central Italy, Rome would soon grow to be the chief city of Latium. From the early days, Rome was a melting pot of different cultural influences. Built on the edge of Latin territory, near the borders with Etruria and close to the Sabines to the north, Rome was a frequent stop for traders of all kinds. It is likely that this multicultural origin is the reason for Rome's open citizenship policy during the Republic. The legendary date of the foundation of the city, 753 BC, is no more than speculation invented by ancient authors. As previously mentioned, the first traces of a permanent settlement can be dated long before that date. Recent discoveries of fortifications on the Palatine, dating to the middle of the 8th century, lend some credibility to the story. However, the first evidence of an organized city-state on these hills are dated to the middle of the 7th century, some 100 years after the legendary date. Romulus would go on to rule his city for 37 long years. After his death, the crown passed from one man to another until it reached a ruler so cruel that Romans swore a sacred oath, never again to let one man rule the city. Join us next time as we discuss the 7 legendary kings of Rome and the overthrow of the monarchy. The region now known as Magna Graecia, Magna Graecia, Magna Graecia, Magna Graecia, Magna Graecia, Magna Graecia, Magna Graecia,